Jewel, the coordinator for the Ancient Burying Ground Association. I want to thank Mariana Garcia from the Old State House and Chip McCabe from Hartford Business Improvement District. They're doing the craft fair outside, so I hope you were able to go out there and check out some of the cool things they have on display. Today we're working with the Old State House to present Richard Ross III. So we've worked with him because of his book, Before Salem, and so we use a lot of this content in the tours that I do about the 17th century witchcraft trials in Hartford and in New England too. So the last tour is going to be on Wednesday, this Wednesday at 1 o'clock. So there's still some room if you want to participate in that. It's been a lot of fun. We've had a lot of really great weather. And so I want to thank everybody that's attended and think about coming next week. Today we're going to talk about American body snatchers. So this is the next project that the author has embarked on, which is super cool. He is also a retired college librarian from Trinity College, and his scholarly interests have included 19th and 20th century German history. And Richard Ross lives in East Windsor, Connecticut. And so I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Thank you for coming, Richard Ross. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I hope this is enlightening, as they say. We'll see, right? But, of course, my talk is based on my book, so that's the way it's going to be. So let's see. And this is the book, American Body Snatchers, and as Christine mentioned, it's available for $35. It's listed for $50 or $49.99, so I'm just letting you know that. Obviously, I don't set the prices, so so that's what I'm selling it for, and the other book is $30. So anyway, enough of that. So let's talk about body snatching. So I started off with this idea of danse macabre, and I'm thinking in terms of New England. This book was written around 1814 to 1816. It was published over time because it's caricatures. And so basically, I bring it up because I'm thinking in the sense of the dance of death. There was a fear that sort of came about in the 19th century for a couple of reasons. And everyday life, of course, there were a lot of things, as that book will show. It's like one caricature after another. But it was in New England, it was a little bit different. First of all, like in England and everywhere else, one of the worst diseases, of course, that one could suffer, it was the most common disease, I should say, not the worst, was consumption or tuberculosis. And the little arrows and things like that usually represent death, represent the disease. So the other thing is that in New England, we also had a kind of vampire scare. So, anybody familiar with that? A few people? Okay. So we had a vampire scare, and as I mentioned here, Griswold, Connecticut, we know about a vampire scare there. We know about the one in Rhode Island, of course, that's most famous. And then there was some up in Vermont too. So that was a fear. It was a legitimate fear. And then the other one, especially after the publication of Poe's Premature Burial, was premature burial. Now, the problem with premature burial and the fear of the vampires was these were somewhat fantasies. That's what I would have to say. But people bought into them, and they were frightened, and they, in a sense, tried to do things to not so much prevent them, but, for example, with the vampires, they buried them in a particular way, hoping they wouldn't come back. And people patented coffins and things like that, not just here in America, of course, but all around the world, because they are afraid of a premature burial. But it wasn't as common as people think. It was more urban, a bunch of urban legends, both of them. But body snatching was real. So it increased due to the introduction, as I have up here, of the new teaching methods in medicine at the beginning of the 19th century, and it required hands-on human dissection. Now, this came about primarily in Paris, and under the Napoleonic Code, the doctors were able to get bodies for their research. Strangely enough, the English-speaking countries were loath to do this. We know that in England, Scotland, and here in the United States, there were laws in place which forbid body snatching. Now, there is a problem with body snatching, just to say it very briefly, is that there's nothing against the law with stealing a body out of the grave. Because the body itself has no value. What the problem was if you took clothing or anything, jewelry or anything else, that in that case you could be prosecuted. But according to common law, you really couldn't prosecute somebody for the theft of a body. So, but the other problem was, of course, that the medical men and doctors needed cadavers to work on. So in England around 1752, they did pass a law that allowed a court, because if someone was convicted of murder, and it had to be a heinous crime, and probably if the family didn't want the body, they could be, when they were hanged, they could be later dissected. It was kind of like an after punishment in a way, very shameful. And the reason I have this little cartoon here is because you see this William Cord. Now this is in England, but of course in the United States they continue to follow English law pretty well. So what you have here is of course you see the body of William Cord on the dissection table. So that's what they allow, because he had been murdered. Body snatching described. Okay, grave robbers pretending to be mourners came to the cemetery to scope out the next victim. Drivers with a carriage would go to the cemetery, local cemetery, and they would drop off a couple of the body snatchers, maybe one or two, and they would go to the grave that they had scoped out, and the driver with the carriage would go away because nobody wants to. I mean, it would have been pretty obvious if there was a carriage sitting out in front of the cemetery in the middle of the night. So they would go and they would dig up the body. Now, they didn't dig up the whole body. They didn't, open up the entire grave. They usually, picked out where the head of where the gravestone was, and they would dig around there. And the idea was, and here we have, the secrets are in the grave robbing business that only a professional ghoul with considerable experience would understand. This is a quote. So when the box is reached, and basically it was where the head was, I go after the stiff and jerk it out. It's a job everybody can't do. If the body sticks in the box, the hooks are put on, and the other fellows help me pull it out. And this is a real hook that they use. It's was known in the trade. It was an unusual type of thing, and people knew when they saw that that's what it was used for. So here we have a visual of the hip hook being used. Well, sometimes it was better if you used a rope. So here we have another image of an alternative method of removing the body. There's less damage to the body by using a rope. And then they would sneak away to the carriage. The carriage driver would come back, and they would run out. Normally speaking, the idea was that the body would be totally nude and would be covered with a cloth or something like that. Because like I told you, if you stole a body and you took the clothing, first of all, that would be an identification. Sometimes people could identify the body if the clothes were taken. And you could be prosecuted for grave robbing because you robbed something that had value, the clothing. The carriage and the driver, after the body has been exhumed, prepared it for delivery, probably to a medical school, or sometimes there were also demonstrators too who weren't in a medical school per se, but had medical students come to their house and they would do the dissection there. and they were delivering the body to his customer in a sack, as I said. And then here I just have, on occasion, they did capture the body snatcher. But it was very difficult, especially once the body was taken into a medical facility or a demonstrator's home. They very quickly did the dissection, and there wasn't much you could identify. There was popular resentment with this idea, and we had a lot of mob justice because there were no real laws against this. So this is an illustration of the 1788 doctors' riot in New York City, and it's titled An Interrupted Dissection. And basically what, very brief because I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but there was a medical student, maybe a couple of medical students, and medical students weren't known for, well, they were actually known for being somewhat dissolute. And so they were waving the leg, a woman's leg, out the window. And they were near where a lot of little children were playing. And one of the medical students yelled out, "This is your mother's leg." Now, one of the little boys that was playing, apparently, his mother had recently passed away. So he ran back to his father, and his father was like a mason or something, that worked with bricks. I'm not the other kind of mason. And so he said to his father, "They've got Mom's body," or something to that effect. And the mason, they went to the cemetery, they dug up the body, they dug up the grave, and the grave was empty. And after that, all hell broke loose. And so a big crowd rioted in front of the New York courthouse. It was estimated that up to 20 people died during this riot. Now, we'll go back to body snatching again. And I'm going to talk quickly about it at Harvard. So in about 1770, medical students, I'm trying to stick with New England, by the way, and Washington, but I did have to bring up the New York one because that was like one of the biggest riots in body snatching riots at the time. About 1770, medical students, including the elder Dr. John Warren, formed a secret society. It was known as the Spunker Club. Its main activity was to obtain cadavers for medical research from Boston graveyards. Holden Chapel at Harvard in 1783 was used as an anatomy laboratory under the auspices of Dr. John Warren, and it served as the laboratory from 1783 to 1810. The Harvard Medical School moved to Boston in 1810. Now, you would think, obviously people were not happy about this because they knew that bodies were being stolen. So there was a lot of concern, and they didn't really want them to come, but they eventually were able to make a deal and came. So from 1810 to 1816, I have Harvard's medical schools located at 400 Washington Street in Boston, Massachusetts. Then in 1816, the school moved to this building that's shown here on Mason Street in Boston and remained its home until 1846. Now, just to say that there was an awful lot of body snatching going on during this time period, particularly between 1810 and 1831, and there's a reason why it declined in 1831, and I'll briefly talk about that later. This, I think, to me, was very interesting. So, this is a certificate of attendance at Dr. John Warren's course of anatomical lectures. Now, this is Israel Keith's certificate of attendance. It's a very famous certificate. Anybody that studies anatomy probably comes across this certificate. And it was awarded to Israel Keith, who was actually not a doctor. They allowed regular people to come in. He was a student at Harvard. I don't know if he was a student at the time, but a graduate of Harvard. And they allowed people to come in and view and learn about anatomy. So this certificate was engraved by Paul Revere. And the thing is that what most people don't know, because I discovered it, I think, is that Israel Keith was a judge too. And one of the first cases of body snatching in Boston came into his courtroom. It was a black man, and he was a free black man. And his wife, she had died, and the doctor who had been attending her stole her body and brought it back to his office to dissect. And he was upset about this, of course, and I have the whole case. It's in my book. And he goes to Israel Keith is the judge. Well, to say he was biased against the Anthony Frederick, that was the fellow's name, is really kind of weird, because he had gotten this certificate. He had bought into this whole business of anatomy and of dissection, and so in the end, he came down on against this fellow. And said that he sort of went back to the idea of common law, which said, well, he may have stolen the body, but the body has no value. And I go through this whole thing in my book. It's interesting because, here we have a judge who actually had attended an anatomy course, basically. So I call this the Great Betrayal in Chabaco, Ipswich, Massachusetts, which later became Essex. So, one night in 1817, I think, 8 bodies had been stolen from the graveyard in the Chabaco parish. And I listed the names of the bodies, and all of them were taken after October 17th of 1817, and maybe early 1818, except for Caesar Conway, who was a black. And he had died 6 years earlier, and his body was missing from the cemetery too. So there was a reward posted in the newspapers for information leading to the grave robbers in Chabaco Parish. Chabaco, as I said, was part of Ipswich, Massachusetts. There was a $500 reward, which was quite a bit of money in those days. So they, advertised this in the newspapers. And we have a sermon, because they never recovered the bodies. So we had a sermon from the Reverend Robert Crowell for the stolen dead, and it was delivered on July 23rd, 1818. And it was reinterring the empty coffins which had been robbed of their contents. That was the sermon. Now, the sermon was published. It's about 40 pages, and it's an excellent case that gets made for why body snatching is inappropriate, both religious, moral, etc. And he takes a lot of the cases of arguments that people that said, well, we should be able to steal bodies out of the cemeteries. As long as nobody knows that they're gone, who does it hurt? These are the kinds of arguments. And so he posits various arguments against it. And the reason I bring it up is because a lot of the arguments that he makes will be the arguments that we'll see pretty much made by people at least up to the Civil War. And the Civil War changes a lot of things. The Second Congregational Church it's now in Essex, Massachusetts, because it became Essex, Massachusetts in 1819, where Crowell's sermon was delivered. And that church stands today. And there were handbills sent around of the horrible event, and you can see some of the things about how inhuman, barbarous, and atrocious the affair was. And at the end, last 2 lines are, who for the sake of gain and filthy lucre, meaning money, of course, robbed the graveyard. This event and the event in other places that are like this, especially in the smaller towns, it's like a gut punch to these people, and it goes from the bitterness goes from generation to generation. This is the Hearst House today in the Essex burial ground, and the empty coffins are said to be buried underneath this building. Now, who perpetrated this? Well, it comes out that it was the town doctor who had actually been treating a lot of these people that died recently. And after they buried them, he went in at night, maybe he had a compatriot, we don't know, and they stole the bodies out of the local cemetery. I brought the Harvard business up a little bit because of this too. He had attended Harvard Medical School in 1811 and 1812, and of course, it was a time when while he was studying anatomy at Harvard, he likely participated also in the robbing of Boston graveyards as a student there. As we know about this, because we have records of the students robbing the graves. Now, people were upset about this, of course, the robbing of graves in Massachusetts, so prior to this, in 1815, Massachusetts passed an act to protect the sepulchres of the dead. Sewell was brought up on charges based on this act in 1818. So it wasn't simply just common law now. They actually had a law in the books that you're not allowed to do this. The case was continued over 2 years, and Dr. Sewell was fined in November 1819 a substantial sum of $800. Now, $800 today doesn't sound like much, but you have to go back and figure out how much it was worth back then. It was probably worth thousands. He was basically forced to move away from Essex, as you can imagine. The town doctor stealing the bodies of his patients. It didn't go too well. The other problem with Dr. Sewell was he had married into the local Choate family. The Choate family is a well-known, well-regarded family, and so he was actually one of the elites, and he was very active in the politics of the town. But he was, because of what he did, of course, he was forced to leave. So he goes to Washington, D.C. What's his name? Daniel Webster was a congressman at the time. And Daniel Webster invites him to come to D.C. and settle there. And so I'm going to come back to this later. So this little bit I want to talk just briefly about, because here we have another betrayal by an elite of the town. So the events in Ipswich had spilled over into Manchester, Massachusetts, which is now called Manchester by the Sea. It's this next town over. The recently installed town minister, Mr. James Thurston, had actively spoken out against Dr. Sewell. Said it was horrible what he did, etc. Along, he and Dr. Kroll both obviously criticized and said it was a disgrace. But he also was unaccountably, for some reason, I don't know why, he was trying to remove the town doctor that they had in Manchester. And because of this, he became embroiled in a controversy that ultimately ended with him being dismissed, and he had to leave. So what happened was Dr. Sewell had received a letter from his brother-in-law, the head of the medical school at Dartmouth College. That's the connection with Dartmouth College, and all this there's all kinds of connections going on here. So his name was Dr. Reuben D. Massey, and he had married Sewell's sister. So he was, in touch with him. So the letter was in reference to a doctor that Thurston wanted to bring to the town of Manchester. And supposedly, he told this Dr. Dewey, who he wanted to bring to Manchester, he might have a fine opportunity for private dissections in Manchester, as there would not be the least difficulty in obtaining subjects there. Well, you can imagine when this got out to the public, all heck broke loose in the town. And so this went on for at least a year. It was a year. There was all kinds of issues which I go into in the book. And finally he was forced to leave town. But he wasn't forced to leave over this in particular. He was forced to leave because there was so much controversy in the town. They figured the only way to quiet things down was to get rid of him and bring another minister in. But there were a lot of people that were really upset about this, as you can imagine. And now we have a body snatching incident at Dartmouth in 1809, 1810. Okay. And this image is from Dartmouth. They let me have it, which I thought was kind of nice. Since the founding of the Dartmouth Medical School, it had always lived under the suspicion of grave robbing. I used to live in New Hampshire, and they were a wily group, by the way. New Hampshire had passed an anti-grave robbing law in 1796. Dr. Nathan Smith, who founded the Dartmouth Medical School in 1797, often complained how difficult and dangerous it was to obtain cadavers up there. And they did go to Enfield, New Hampshire, and they obtained the body of a young boy. It was some students. And as a result, one of the medical students, I should say, dropped a letter or a note and sort of gave it away. And when he was trying to, on the way, they brought the boy's body back to the medical school, and the information was there, what had happened, and so the townspeople, got broke into the medical school. And so they got the body back. They negotiated to get the body back, and it had already been sort of cut up. And one of Dr. Nathan Smith's students said, well, look, you can have the body back. I'll sew it back up for you. So he sewed it together, and he said, I hope that after we've done this that you won't make any trouble. And as I said, I don't know what he expected, because of course the father complained about what had happened, and it caused a lot of hardship in town, and also it caused changes in the way that they ran the medical school at Dartmouth. But this concern of not being able to get bodies, he was getting a lot of his bodies, he would order them from Boston. He would ask somebody, he knew some doctors in Boston, he would say, well, would you get a medical student who's sort of down on his luck and wants to do this, to get a few bodies together and send them up to us? And those are in his letters. So, but this trouble about trying to get bodies for his research, for his medical school, this motivated him to eventually leave Dartmouth and go to Yale. Now I'm going to talk about the body snatching incident and riot in New Haven, Connecticut. Now this is the 200th anniversary, by the way. This riot occurred in 1824. So what happened? In January 1819, it was discovered that a Revolutionary War hero, his name was Mr. Major Tiff's body had been stolen from its grave in Southbury, Connecticut. And people had noticed this, that there'd been disruption around the grave. So the townspeople, as I write here, were infuriated, and they passed strict town ordinances to punish body snatchers, and had these posted, not just in the town, but they made sure they were published in the New Haven newspapers, because everybody knew that the body snatching was going on because of the Yale Medical School. In May 1819, the Connecticut legislature tried to pass similar strict measures that they had inspired by, I think, the Southbury town ordinances. But the Senate, the House passed the strict measures, but the Senate voted the legislation down, and the measure failed. So following the failure to pass this legislation, there was an undercurrent of more resentment in New Haven and the surrounding towns toward the Yale Medical College. Well, when a young, respectable woman of 19, Bathsheba Smith's body was taken from the West Haven Cemetery in January 1824, the resentment burst into a full-scale riot. Here we have a picture of the Yale Medical College. Here's a picture of the West Haven Cemetery. And three men were suspected. One eventually was charged. And now here's a description of Bathsheba Smith's plundered grave. There'd been a disturbance of the ground. Some stalks of straw were scattered about that had been laid upon the top of the coffin. When the coffin was reached, it was seen to have a split open. It had been split open, and a log of wood had been substituted for the body. And so I have a picture here of a log of wood in a coffin that I found recently. And so that's what it might have looked like. Women fear ending up on the dissecting table. They fear the loss of modesty after death. This is kind of a problem with some of this, particularly a respectable young woman would be obviously naked on the dissecting table. And it was, you can imagine what it was like in the 19th century, how people felt modesty was extremely important. And even in death, these people feared, many of these women feared that they might end up on a table. And this is what they thought of medical students at the time. This is a dissolute fellow viewing the naked body of a respectable young lady. This idea only increased the popular anxiety. This is, by the way, an English student, but the American students were the same. Yale medical students were immediately suspected of stealing Bathsheba's body. So on the morning of January 12, 1824, Dr. Jonathan Knight, Yale's first professor of anatomy and physiology, was informed the body of Bathsheba Smith, 19, had been stolen from the West Haven Cemetery. Suspicion fell on the Yale Medical School. A mob was raised from the surrounding towns, it wasn't just New Haven, and marched on the medical building. The excited crowd gathered on the green where different people addressed them, demanding the medical school building be torn down. They'd even obtained one of the town cannons. Now, I just got this picture. I liked it because this takes place when General Lafayette visited, but I like the fact that at least they had a picture of the cannon in it. So to me, that was kind of neat, you know. So I couldn't find it anywhere else. The Connecticut governor's foot guards, there were about 20 men, was activated to save the Yale Medical Building from destruction. The medical building is searched. So the building was searched by Erastus Osborne. He was a constable. He could not find her body. The crowd wasn't satisfied, though, and threatened violence. So a committee was appointed that included Dr. Jonathan Knight and Dr. Nathan Smith. The committee began a second search. Erastus Osborne reported, this is a quote from him, "We came to a place in the pavement, the cellar being paved with large stones. We soon found the earth appeared fresher between the stones, and finally took up a large flat stone where we discovered a white bundle, apparently a bundle of clothes. We examined it and found a human body doubled up in a heap, entirely covered up with grave clothes. We took it out, and it was immediately known to be the body of the young woman we were searching for." Bathsheba's body was loaded onto a wagon and taken to her parents' home for a service and burial. The church bells tolled incessantly, ginning up the mob and the crowd. "We've never known so great an excitement in the city on any occasion as witnessed during the past week." This is a quote from the New Haven Register on January 17th, 1824. This is a little over, the rioting is a little bit overdone here, but this is actually a riot that took place in Philadelphia, but I used it as an example of what could happen. Ephraim Colburn was named as one of the people that had snatched her body. The authorities, both civil and military, were prepared to let the mob riot, most likely to avoid the carnage that we witnessed earlier in the doctors' riot in New York. The accused man, Ephraim Colburn, initially refused to provide any information. He was jailed and released on bond. As he tried to leave the courthouse, he saw citizens preparing a pot of hatter's glue to tar and feather him. So he returned to the jail. So this is him, you know, this is what he's imagining, being tarred and feathered. He wasn't, though. New Haven State House and Courthouse, where Ephraim was tried. This is a picture of the first State House at New Haven. Ephraim was found guilty by the jury for acting and assisting in opening the grave and removing the body of a female from the burying ground in Orange, West Haven. The two towns had just come together at that time for the purpose of dissection, and was sentenced for 9 months imprisonment in the county jail and a fine of $300. This is based on a Connecticut law of 1810 for a punishment for disinterring a body. There's a picture of Bathsheba's grave today in West Haven, Connecticut. I know it's hard to see, but her name is at the very bottom of the stone. I'm not sure if she's actually there or not, but her name's there, and it's her parents who are listed above. Because she was originally, when they took her from the, when they found her and took her on the wagon, they took her to her parents' home, and they supposedly buried her in the parents' yard so they could watch over her. So it's possible she was moved later, but I don't know that for a fact. Well, so people were really upset, as you can imagine. And then we're going to say in the spring, late spring, early summer of 1824, we had another incident here in Hartford. A body snatching of Miss Jane Benton in the South Burying Ground right here in Hartford. And it was reported on June 2nd, 1824. And the reason I bring it up is because this one actually probably was, in a way, helped push this new law that was going to be passed through. The other thing is there's a famous article about the problem with body snatching and what happened here in Connecticut. It was published in England, and there's no mention of Bathsheba Smith, but there is the mention of Miss Jane Benton. What happened with her, just quickly, was that, okay, she was mentally ill, and she was out, and she went for a walk, and she didn't come home, and her parents went for her, and everybody found, they sent a search parties out, they found she had drowned. So she was buried in the South Burying Ground, and, her name, obviously, the fact that she had passed away was mentioned. So some grave robbers apparently went to the cemetery, dug her up, and were going to sell her body. But unfortunately, she had drowned. Well, when you drown and you're in the water for a while, the body's no good. It deteriorates too rapidly, particularly when it hits the air. So what had happened was when they dug up her body to see if she was in the grave, they found her body, but it was couldn't be used, and so that was a real issue at the time, and so following this, the legislature passed the Anatomy Act of 1824, and it was really was meant to punish body snatchers with harsh penalties and those who received illegal bodies. During the discussion of the Anatomy Act, for the first time in any legislative body, there was a suggestion to use the poor, who are recipients of public charity, for dissection. For the first time, it permitted the use of all prisoners' bodies at the state prison, or what we know today as Newgate Prison, to be sent for dissection when they passed away. And women were never confined to Newgate Prison, but county jails instead. So it was only if you were a prisoner at Newgate. The act simply did not meet the demand for cadavers. I just have a picture. This is Newgate Prison, if you don't know about it. The cells were way downstairs, and at the bottom here, way at the bottom. That's where they kept them. During the day, they would be up, doing hard labor. So the 1824 Act wasn't very effective in providing more bodies for the dissectors. Now, in 1831, Massachusetts passed the Massachusetts Anatomy Act, which provided that the unclaimed bodies of the poor in Boston, also Charlestown, could be furnished for dissection. This predated the the famous Parliamentary Anatomy Act of 1832 by 1 year, actually. And that Parliamentary Act, of course, was in England. The Connecticut Anatomy Act of 1833 was admittedly modeled on the Massachusetts Act, but the terms were inherently flawed when applied to Connecticut. The Anatomy Act of 1833, after much heated discussion, permitted the bodies of the poor in Connecticut who would be required to be buried by the state to be used for dissection. The problem was that in Massachusetts, the act was only used in Boston and Charlestown. It was only applied there. The thing about what was going on in Boston was they were getting plenty of immigrants from like Ireland and other places. It was a seaport town, and so there was no real resistance to this act. However, here in Connecticut, one of the problems was, or a couple of problems, but one of the major problems was that the poor law in Connecticut was set up so that each town was responsible for its own poor. So what happened, of course, these people were neighbors and friends. And so the idea that they would take their bodies after death and send them to be dissected was anathema. People got really upset. And here we have the New London Gazette right away on October 9th, 1833, saying, look, we're not going to go along with this. Our selectmen, we're going to take charge here, and we're going to take the discretionary power out of the hands of our selectmen, and that's what they did. And this was done throughout the towns of Connecticut. So by the act will be repealed. The 1833 Act will be repealed in 1834 because people were so upset about it. They considered it a horrible act. So the Anatomy Act of 1833 was repealed under the new governor, Samuel A. Foote, in 1834 for several reasons, but one of the most important was that there also had been, since then, an economic depression in which the legislators argued that any day any one of them could find themselves in poverty and become victims of this law. In New Hampshire and in Vermont, they had some law. New Hampshire had passed the law in 1834 that was similar to using the poor, and they repealed it in 1842, and Vermont discussed it but never passed a law. Well, around the same time, just before, actually this helped to institute these laws, was the body snatching uproar in Scotland. William Burke and William Hare murdered their victims and sold them to Dr. Knox in Edinburgh, Scotland. Lurid accounts appeared throughout the world, actually, during the trial of the heinous crimes of William Burke and William Hare, and this all went global. As a result, William Burke was eventually tried and convicted of murder, and William Hare turned state's evidence, and he was not tried. But the effects of what they had done lingered on, that it was necessary, people felt, to get bodies because if people were turning, because they could make good money doing this if they didn't get caught. And if people were turning to this, we better find another way to get bodies for the schools. So the outcry over the Burke and Hare incident led in 1832 to the passage in Parliament in England of an Anatomy Act. So the only two surviving antebellum anatomical acts that allowed the use of the unclaimed poor or prisoners' bodies for medical dissection in the United States before the Civil War was the Massachusetts law enacted in 1831 and the New York Bone Bill in 1854 that allowed for criminals and the unclaimed bodies of vagrants to be given up for dissection. It was passed in New York, the New York legislature, by only one vote in April 1854. And just briefly, body snatching in Vermont. This gut punch I talked about was real. In 50 years after this incident, I'm going to quickly tell you about. Mrs. Penfield Churchill was buried in Hubbardton, Vermont. Her body was stolen and brought to Castleton Medical School in Vermont. When the town realized what had happened, a mob, the whole town, marched on Castleton. When they got there, the students acted very rudely toward them, and the townspeople said, "We're going to burn down the school unless you don't give us back, Mrs. Penfield's body." So the husband had a hard time recognizing the body, but he finally did, except for her head was missing. So one of the students had put the head under his cloak and had gone and hidden it in a barn. So he got the body, and they were bringing it back to Hubbardton, and somebody found the head in the hayloft, and they rushed to bring the head back so the head could be put with the body. So this was the people of Hubbardton were really, really obviously upset about this, and they were upset about the rude way they were treated and the fact that their bodies were being stolen. So 50 years later, a doctor wrote this Song of the Hubbardton Raid, and it was, as far as the people of Hubbardton were concerned, it was a cruel, cruel thing to have opened up this old wound. So what they did was they had another poem written, sort of a riposte, a poem called A Poem of the Hubbardton Raid. And this poem eviscerated the poem that this John Currier had written, called The Raid of the Citizens. Vermont had three medical schools in the 1820s through the 1840s. The University of Vermont Medical School, the Castleton Medical School, and the Woodstock Medical School. Body snatching was so prevalent in Vermont that one historian noted between 1820 and 1840, medical students in Vermont used at least 400 cadavers. Most were illegally acquired. All were obtained within the boundary of Vermont, and like many empty graves throughout other parts of New England as well. So there were plenty of places in New England where there were plenty of empty graves. I just reused this because I just liked it. And anyway, they were kind of right next to each other. They would go back and forth between Vermont and New Hampshire to steal bodies. So there were arguments against body snatching, obviously. There was a really strong religious argument because of what we call the bodily resurrection. That was expected. The body would actually be resurrected. That was simply immoral, and financial, that somebody paid for a funeral and expected the loved one to rest in peace and remain in the grave, why should a grave robber financially benefit from selling the body? Shaming the family, the role of dissection in the past as an extra punishment for gross criminality. Pre-Civil War resistance to dissecting the poor or the unclaimed. So there was plenty of resistance to dissecting the poor. The ignominy and shame of the act itself, religious objections, and social and economic conditions that argued anyone could find themselves in poverty by an accident of fate. So that was another thing. So here we have pre-Civil War importance of the resurrection of the body on Judgment Day. Again, the expectation was the body itself would be resurrected. Pre-Civil War arguments for body snatching. Laws required doctors to have experience with cadavers. There simply were not enough bodies to be obtained legally. Dissecting bodies would provide doctors for training and experience to benefit the living and hopefully avoid malpractice suits. That was a real issue. The dead should be used to the benefit. The dead should be used to benefit the greater good, that being the living. When the dead are removed secretly, no one knows, family and friends are not harmed. Some of these arguments would take on a different life later after the Civil War. So now I want to talk about body snatching coming to Washington, D.C. So Dr. Sewell, I told you, went to Washington, D.C. under the auspices of Daniel Webster. Did I say Daniel Webster? He joins the newly established Columbian College in 1821. Columbian College is George Washington University today. He creates the Columbian Department of Medicine, which becomes operational in 1825. His focus is on anatomy, and there are indications that cadavers are being supplied for courses at the school. Sewell's success, the Columbian College Medical Department. Sewell successfully argues that there should only be one medical school in Washington, D.C. He notes there's a lack of population for more than one school. And that means there's just not enough people dying to supply the medical school with bodies. This is code that the competition for bodies in other cities between schools had led to much trouble and embarrassment. And you can read about this, of course, in Philadelphia and New York. And Philadelphia was also another body snatching center. The school finally obtained a hospital, the Washington Infirmary in D.C. in 1844, for which they had exclusivity of the patients. Now, it troubles you to think they might be able to get bodies for dissection there. But one of the problems was that a lot of people, obviously had family, and so they would, if someone passed away, they would want the body so they could bury it. So we know that body snatching was going on this is what happened, very briefly. They shut the school down from 1834 to 1839. For some reason, we don't know why. And so they reopened again, and they got a new home at this place I told you was the old jail. In 1844, Dr. Thomas Miller, who has been a professor at Columbia College, he'd been a member of the medical department of Columbian College, okay? Dr. Lewin Elliott wrote, his father was a body snatcher and demonstrated there in 1844. So we sort of have evidence that, there was body snatching going on. How the Civil War changed attitudes and demand. American Civil War medicine exposed doctors to surgery and the importance of dissection in the training of physicians. They used chloroform and ether in operations. They began to understand the importance of antiseptics to prevent infection. One thing I quickly tell you is that prior to the Civil War, there weren't that many hospitals in the United States, and most surgery was done at home, and very little surgery was done, basically because a lot of people would get sepsis. They would die from infection, blood infection. So how did they treat people? Well, they treated people with potions and pills and all those kinds of things that snake oil stuff. Of course, there were the quacks the doctors would say they had snake oil, and the regular doctors who were giving their patients mercury and antimony and all kinds of, and of course drugs like cocaine and things like that. So I don't know if there was much of a difference. Anyway, so following the Civil War, the need for bodies for medical schools increased even more because there were more medical schools being open, and people had got the exposure in the military, doctors, that, that there's something, that this was necessary. They had some experience and they needed to teach it to their students. So post-Civil War causes the Gilded Age. So to prevent grave robbery, one solution starts to become more popular. We can dissect the bodies of the poor and those that died in prison. But instead of having everybody popular opinion against it, popular opinion began to turn. Rationale: the poor had lived off charity, and it only made sense for them to repay the charity they had enjoyed during their life. Prisoners, of course, were self-evident. People began to see improvements in medicine. Public health and life expectancy, germ theory of disease was discovered. The use of ether in operations all contributed to the above sentiment. People were living a little bit longer, and they could see that the medicine was improving and improving their lives. The religious focus, due to the experience during the Civil War, began to shift from the bodily resurrection to the more spiritual. And this paralyzes the rise of spiritualism here, and mediums and contacting the dead and all that. If you're familiar with this, this did occur before the Civil War, but it really took off after the Civil War. You saw that picture I showed you of the young family looking at all the soldiers that were dead, piled up, and their bodies were piled up, and basically thrown around like animals. And this is kind of one of the things that people saw a lot of these, not these pictures, but pictures of, as you probably know, of Civil War soldiers dead, and actually some of them were posed. And the idea became people began to think in terms of the body not being a somewhat magical, but something that that the spirit was more important. Let's put it that way. And there was a whole change in the way that they treated the dead after the Civil War. But the idea that this idea of the bodily resurrection started to die out, which made it possible for people to say, oh, well, if somebody is dissected, it doesn't really make that much difference. And we're also operating with new ideas like Darwinism that undermines religion, Spencer's view of social Darwinism, and the third thing I had was Darwinism, and utilitarianism by Jeremy Bentham. The idea of utilitarianism is that you should do what's good for the most, basically. So the idea of saying, okay, well, these people that were poor, and we gave them charity, they should in return give us something back, and giving us something back was their bodies so that they could be dissected. The rise of anatomy laws in many states followed the Civil War. They were seen as utilitarian and lauded as preventing grave robbing. This was a big thing. Every law practically, you will see that they're putting it in place to provide, so that this hopefully will prevent grave robbing. Because I don't want to get into it too much here, but the idea after the Civil War, you began to get, the one thing I want to tell you about the Civil War, the other thing about the body and the Civil War and all that, remember, a lot of men and women too, but mostly men that were soldiers, were lost and never returned home. There was no closure. And so the idea of spiritualism, being able to contact them spiritually, became something that people went after. That's something that was very important to them. So getting back to this, so following the Civil War, these laws were seen as utilitarian, meaning we can now, what we should be able to do now is use the bodies of the poor so they won't go into the graveyards and steal our beloved dead. Of course, this didn't happen immediately, and it didn't happen without some very high-profile scandals and mob violence against medical schools due to the grave robbing suspicions in many of these states, particularly now in the Midwestern states. The most famous one is Senator John Scott Harrison, the father of Benjamin Harrison, who became president in 1888. John's body was stolen May 26, 1878. His nephew, I guess, and a friend, they went looking for the body, and they ended up going to, I think, the medical school in Ohio, and they went into the dissection laboratory, and they were looking around. They didn't see the body, and I figured, well, I guess he's not here. And then something happened, and there was in the middle, there was like a hook with a big cloth attached to it, And somebody raised it, and when they raised it, the cloth came off, and that was the body of their uncle, John Scott Harrison. And this turned into a major scandal at the time. So the consequences of Civil War medicine was that the war in general was a vast educational enterprise for spreading modern medical knowledge to every corner of the American world, and none more so than in D.C., where there's now three medical schools in that small footprint: Columbian College Medical Department, Georgetown Medical School in 1851, and Howard University Medical School in 1869. With numerous cemeteries, a cooperative city government, and no antibody snatching laws, D.C. became an important body snatching center and supplier for cadavers for other states after the Civil War. We're fortunate to have a diary of a body snatcher in Washington, D.C. by the name of George Christian. As I could see, after the Civil War, Washington, D.C. became the heyday of body snatching here in D.C. His diary covers January 1st, 1873 to December 2nd, 1873. He and his cohorts robbed many of the cemeteries in D.C., especially black cemeteries. The first trial related to the diary occurred in December 1873 concerning a body stolen in October. Other entries and letters found on Christian noted he was also selling bodies to medical schools in other states. So from the diary we get a quote: "At least we know who he was stealing some bodies for. He attended a funeral at Congressional Cemetery today and brought the subject in Georgetown College tonight." Now, the Washington Asylum, he worked out of the Washington Asylum with medical doctors that were employed there. The Washington Asylum was a combination of sort of a jail, an almshouse, so to speak, for the poor, and a hospital, particularly for old people that were really on their last legs. And they had a potter's field out behind the hospital. And the potter's field was where they got a lot of their bodies, because once they were out there, nobody really cared. But they also got bodies everywhere else too, because a lot of those bodies probably weren't fit for a good dissection. Doctors, I say at this time, also robbed graves. A ring of recent graduates from Georgetown College worked out of the Washington Asylum with Christian in the early 1870s. Now, one of the most egregious things that occurred was the Bo Hickman scandal. And Bo Hickman is a well-known semi-celebrity who died poor and was initially buried in Potter's Field. Christian had dug up his body and removed parts of it on the evening of September 2nd, 1873. Friends wanted to give him a proper burial and later had him dug up. When they opened the shattered coffin, they saw a disfigured body with missing limbs, and his head had been skinned. This caused great alarm in Washington, especially among the public. Bo's remains were later interred at the Congressional Cemetery. The other thing that we know about was the shipping of bodies outside of Washington. And the bodies were shipped not just out of Washington, but in other places too. And they were shipped primarily in whiskey barrels, and railroads provided the transportation for the rapid shipment of bodies throughout the nation. So now we had improvements in transportation led to improvements in shipping bodies where they were needed, up to New England, to the Midwest. George Christian appealed his conviction on February 9, 1874, and on September 24, 1874, George was pardoned by President Grant with the support of the medical establishment in D.C. He was later charged with desecrating graves, and while out on bail, he failed to appear in court. He was captured but escaped. He's said to have died in Philadelphia in 1896 and asked not to let his remains fall into the hands of the medical fraternity. So he didn't want it to be dissected. Shortly afterwards, we have this Viggo Jensen Ross, no relation, a notorious body snatcher and king of the ghouls. And he was well known throughout Maryland and Washington, D.C. for stealing bodies. Now, he decided that he was going to make his case, so he actually gave a lecture like this, but his was, he was called a resurrectionist, and what he did was he got on stage and he showed people how one would rob a grave. He did not speak English very well, and so he was it was almost like he was drunk as far as people were concerned, and so the criticism of his talk was very, very, they did not approve of it, the critics, and they thought it was a terrible thing, the very idea of doing this. But the one thing he did say was that he was in the business, there were people that needed these bodies, and that the biggest body snatcher of all was the Surgeon General. And people laughed and thought he was, being ridiculous. Soon afterwards, Jensen Ross and his cohorts were caught entering a cemetery at night in 1884. And he did admit to furnishing bodies to now what's called the National Medical College, which is, National Medical College is the same as the Columbian Medical School. They just called it that too. It took me a while to figure this out. So to take the heat off, because the police were constantly guarding the cemeteries, and they weren't getting the bodies they needed, they decided to take the heat off, and so the schools made up a purse to induce Jensen Ross to leave D.C. so other body snatchers could get back to work. And this is just a picture of Columbian University Medical School, also known as the National Medical College. It's about 1892. This is an obituary for Vigo Ross, the grave robber who committed suicide in October 1887. By 1887, 16 states had passed anatomy laws. And there was one in the state of Michigan in particular. There was a representative in Washington. And he said that, we found that in that part of the state of Michigan, near to our medical college, something analogous to a reign of terror prevailed amongst the people who were called upon to bury their dead, that there was a feeling that no grave was sacred, and there was no assurance the dead would rest where they had been laid. And after they passed these laws, a lot of this died away. Now the Washington medical community comes clean. So there was a first anatomy bill for Washington, D.C. was proposed in April 1886, and it was modeled on the Maryland anatomy bill. But it didn't pass because Grover Cleveland didn't think it was sufficiently detailed for who was responsible for the disposition of the unclaimed pauper dead. The D.C. medical community, the federal government, Army, Navy, and Marine surgeon generals all admitted to using purloined cadavers in the instruction of potential doctors in support of when they were supporting the anatomy bill. In other words, they admitted that over the years they had been using illegally obtained bodies. The dean of the National Medical School admitted in a letter to Congress that the police and judicial authorities are fully cognizant of this method, and the police often visit our dissecting rooms at their pleasure and could, if they chose, arrest every one of us. There were multiple attempts by the U.S. Congress to pass an anatomy bill in D.C. As you know, D.C. really wasn't authorized to do these kinds of things. In those days, D.C. was pretty much run by the U.S. Congress. So I'm going to just go over this briefly and just say that, so the medical schools in D.C. did want to remove the odium of body snatching off themselves. So they initially supported a bill to do this again. But what happened was, in the bill it said that anyone caught body snatching would receive a punishment of 2 to 3 years at hard labor. In addition, it was calculated the demand would exceed the supply if they only depended on the unclaimed poor for the cadavers. So essentially what happened was they realized they needed these illegal body snatchers. And they knew that if the punishment was 2 to 3 years at hard labor, that these body snatchers would leave. They wouldn't be doing this. It wasn't worth it. So Washington, D.C.'s reputation during the last 30 years of the 19th century was pretty bad. There's no other city in the Union where, in proportion to its size, grave robbery is carried on so extensively as it is in the capital of the nation. In Washington, D.C., the violation of a sepulture is almost as common as house robberies in New York City. This is just an image of a resurrectionist cart from a newspaper wending its way through D.C. in 1892. By the late 1880s, the D.C. colleges had free reign over Potter's Field in D.C., known as the scientific ground. Officials estimated of the 10,000 graves in Potter's Field, there were fewer than 400 in 1892. Other cemetery officials admitted if one dug up the graves in their cemeteries, one would likely find hundreds of empty coffins in every cemetery. They finally passed a law, the Act for the Promotion of Anatomical Sciences, and to prevent the desecration of graves in the District of Columbia. This is on every one of these laws. Although there were extensive restrictions, the difference in punishment from a possible 3-year prison term at hard labor, as proposed in the 1892 bill, it was changed to 1 year in the workhouse. It was obviously a compromise to maintain the availability of some resurrectionists needed by the schools, if necessary, to obtain buy-in from the colleges. By the beginning of the 20th century, body snatching was not eliminated, but the procurement, dissection, and disposal of cadavers became, for most citizens, an invisible process and a distant issue. Newspapers continued to report on body snatchings. They were rare and made good newspaper copy. And this is from Charles Dickens, who wrote A Tale of Two Cities. And this Jerry Cruncher is invoked throughout a lot of the arguments that go on that I read in even in Congress. He explains to his son that resurrectionists are honest tradesmen whose wares are a branch of scientific goods. The idea has come to fruition today in the 21st century with the trade in body parts from the dead and the living, both legal and the illegal. And that's the end. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, sure. I love questions. Anybody have any?
Back then they had coffins because they were commercial burials.
I'm sorry, what's that?
Back then they had specialized coffins because they were commercial burials.
They had special coffins.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
So designed coffins to prevent grave robbing.
Yeah, well, the regular people couldn't afford them. The rich always could afford it. They used to, that's why I guess they come up with the mausoleums and things like that, although they could still break into them, There was one cemetery, Oak Hill Cemetery, I read about in Washington, D.C., which I thought was interesting. They bricked up the graves so that you couldn't get into them. Once you put the coffins in with the body, the sides were all bricked up, the whole thing. That was one of the few cemeteries where it was very difficult to get somebody out of the coffin. But you're right, they did do that. They tried. But as they say, some of the doctors said that basically, don't worry about the fact that you think we won't be able to get to you, but we will. So the only way to really avoid it was to kind of let the body, put it someplace where it would deteriorate enough so that it would be no good for dissection. Yes?
So in some of these instances, if they're transporting bodies out of state, how do they preserve them during travel? Or portable ice boxes?
No, they could use like whiskey, but they also use sawdust. Christian used sawdust. He put them in wrapped them in sawdust and then shipped the bodies in containers, generally barrels, but sometimes other types of containers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, to answer this gentleman's question, it's a little bit clearer. What you're talking about, the coffins that were developed, most of that was because being in a coma was not understood, okay? So at that time, you had a thing called wake, where people would be laid out in the house because they were discovering that people were being buried thinking they were dead, but they were in a coma. One way that was discovered is because the body snatchers often, I have a few stories on that, where they would go and dig
thank you, everybody, for coming, and Richard has some of his books available for purchase over here, and just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. Did everybody learn something?